Hello, this is Adam Carroll, and this is UN This Week. We're talking today about migration. We find ourselves in the midst of a global crisis of displacement, which includes both refugees and forced migrants fleeing conflict, oppression, and climate change impact. Still, other migrants seek opportunity and escape from poverty in the time-honored fashion. Millions succeed and bring benefits to both their adopted homes and their countries of origin, but many are also exploited and even persecuted. Only 2 weeks ago, at least 140 migrants drowned off the coast of Senegal on the way to a new life in the Canary Islands. Despite spiritual traditions around the world that really emphasize caring for the stranger, harsh xenophobic reaction to migrants has been on the increase even before the pandemic. To discuss recent trends, as well as what the international community is doing to confront the challenges, we welcome Professor Marciana Popescu. Professor Popescu is Associate Professor at Fordham University's Graduate School of Social Service and has been Senior Fulbright Scholar in Austria. Professor Popescu is interested in forced migration, migration policies within the EU, the European Union, as well as in the US, the role of higher education institutions in addressing forced migration, and the impact of migration policies on women, asylum seekers, and refugees. I noticed the professor has many very interesting articles and studies that she has authored and co-authored, including social work with migrants and refugees, roles and responsibilities in addressing displacement and forced migration in Haiti, religiosity and values in Romania, effects of intimate partner violence among Seventh-day Adventist church attendees, and trauma-informed organizational readiness assessment. Yikes. Well, we're all needing some of that right now. But welcome to the show, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You are part of the NGO Committee on Migration, which for the last 12 years has worked to realize justice for migrants, refugees, stateless persons, internally displaced persons, and trafficked persons in accordance with the UN Charter. With over 50 NGOs involved, I guess this committee is a member of the Conference of Non-Governmental Organizations in consultative relationship with the UN Economic and Social Council. Big mouthful, but it's a really impressive NGO committee, I have to say. I've gone to the website, and I was wondering if briefly you could just show us around in what the NGO committee actually does.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Actually, I want to thank you for inviting me and to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak not only about migration concerns, but about some of the strengths that we developed during the past 3, 4, 5 years and more when the civil society emerged strong and powerful and started really taking a stand on various issues, among which migration. If you would want actually to go, because you are on the website right now, if you want to go to the second tab on the top, you can see the various subcommittees, because each of these subcommittees are important for the work we do. I don't know if you can make that bigger. I don't see it very big here at my end. Yes. So as you can see, like we have multiple subcommittees there that are taking tasks for various aspects of forced migration. The subcommittee I'm part of directly, and I was engaged with for the past 3 years, is the Subcommittee on Migrants in Vulnerable Situations. Now here we are focusing a lot on mixed migration, situations that do not fit nicely, neatly in a category. And we know that most of the forced migrants are actually characterized by this. Are they asylum seekers? They might be based on the criteria that we see there, but by law, the way in which laws are written and the way in which laws are implemented do not always allow them that status. Are they refugees? Are they undocumented? What does that mean? What makes a difference between a refugee and an undocumented migrant? So that's one of the committees that we are working on. There is another committee that really focuses on xenophobia. And as we know, like during these times, one aspect that became extremely problematic is the increase in nationalism and xenophobia. So this committee is doing a lot of work to educate, to inform, to raise awareness, and to develop tools that we can use to actually address xenophobia and really put migration into a different context, change the lenses on migration.
I did want to ask about the xenophobia, because our producer has a link to the infographic about xenophobia. Maybe we could show that on the screen.
Yes, sure.
And because I think xenophobia is a big problem these days. And, with COVID-19, we see that migrants are one of the vulnerable communities that are being blamed for the spread of the virus quite unfairly.
Absolutely. And if you actually look at, how this, what we label as the migration crisis emerged, if we go back to, like over the last decade, right? We go back to 2011, the conflict in Syria started in 2015. We have the little 2-year-old boy being washed ashore, right? And that body of a child, gets the global attention and people respond. And yet 2016 on, the entire discourse changes. New labels are being attached to migrants. Migrants are perceived and represented as the reason for the crisis we are in, although migration is not a crisis and definitely not caused by the migrants themselves. So all that led to waves of increased nationalism. And that is in a way rooted in the fear of losing our identities. And I think we need to acknowledge that, because we cannot, pretend it doesn't happen. Actually, when I was in Austria, I was speaking to an older lady, all goodness and, welcoming, and yet she was very anti-immigrant. And in our conversation, she said, I'm looking around me and I worry who will be an Austrian in a few years. And I'm thinking, everything in me revolts against this thought, but the reality is people are afraid and we cannot dismiss the fears, right? So social identities were being used in a political discourse that actually aimed to increase, anti-immigrant attitudes.
And she didn't realize, she didn't realize that she was actually speaking to someone from another place, and that, you would identify with migrants, of course.
Well, no, she actually was realizing, because I was there to discuss the issue of refugees, because this is part of a village that was initially very welcoming. But it is very interesting to see how fear is being used by different, parties to actually increase nationalism and actually push people, pit people against each other. It was interesting, the graph from the graphic from the infographic that you had there, that actually talks about some of the myth. We're talking about, migration, there's the migration wave, migrants are taking over. What are they taking over? They are taking over the Western world and the US. And actually what we see is that over 76% of the migrants are hosted in developing countries, and actually over 83% are hosted in neighboring countries. Those countries are actually bearing the most of the burden of forced migration. While the United States,
I'm so sorry. Does the committee work on? Well, I think we're all aware that migrants have been demonized in the United States. Does the committee work on that?
Yes, and this infographic was part of that work. I'm not working directly with that subcommittee, but what we learned from their work is that they develop tools and they organize webinars, and they are working with professionals. Keep in mind that this committee is actually a representation of the civil society. So what we hope to do is to penetrate the larger society and dispel the myth. and actually create opportunities. And today was, one great opportunity to hear from youth leaders, but we create opportunities to also bring in migrants and have them educate us. I don't think any of us can call ourselves experts on migration as long as we never lived in a situation of forced migration. I know I didn't. So I always, need to learn from the migrants themselves. And the migrant stories are so powerful because they are indicating what needs to be changed, what works, what doesn't work. And more important, who are they? How do they want to be represented? And here is again, a claim for social identities on the other side, because we need to feel safe enough to identify with that part of us that we want to identify with and present that to the rest of the world. And that's one aspect that is taken away by forced migration.
It came to mind that many years ago when I was in Egypt, staying at a youth hostel, it was filled with Indians, and it turned out that they had been abandoned by their employer without pay, and they were stuck. And somehow the hostel took them in. But I remember at that point in my life, I had never thought of that sort of thing happening. And just to see all these people around me dressed traditionally and kind of lost and making, cooking, in survival mode. And I thought, what is going to happen to them? So I think this is very common, unfortunately, this kind of exploitation.
Yes, it is. And unfortunately, although we made a lot of progress in at least developing some global frameworks that are well put together and have good elements in them to work with and increase protection for migrants and claim the rights of migrants, the human rights that we all have, right? Yet even with these frameworks in place, what we are seeing and what we hear from people that are sharing their stories is that we are still not where we should be. We're not implementing these aspects the way we should. And yes, that's one of the frameworks that I was referring to. Actually, I do have a slide. I don't know if I can share it with you.
Yeah, that would be great.
I'll try, and we'll see what happens. If it doesn't work, I'll give up. But okay, so I don't know if can you see this? Can you see my slide?
All right, let's give it a moment to see if the slide appears, but I don't see it yet.
Okay. I thought it will appear immediately when I share.
Yeah, because last time it did. Try sharing again.
Okay, let's see. Because I see it here. Let's try this. Okay, I think now we might be able to, but for some reason it doesn't give me okay. So do you see my slide now?
Here it comes. Yes, here we are.
Okay, and you see it well now? Yes. So do you see my slide?
Yeah, and I see you're mentioning Aylan Kurdi right there. Yeah.
Yes. What I wanted to actually, why did I prepare this slide? Because I thought it's easier to kind of see how things progressed over the last decade. And it's interesting when we are talking about migration over the last decade, we refer to migration as something new. Although migration was with us all along, it's part of the human history. People move in search of new opportunities or running away from danger. This happened historically. However, the last decade was so packed with so many issues. Only in the last decade alone, based on data we have, over 100 million people were forcibly displaced. Right now, we have a total of 79.5 million people that are forcibly displaced. But, just taking a few glimpses into this this is not exhaustive by any means. You can see how things change. It takes one body of a child to get the public attention. And then, you expect that changes will come. Yet in 2016, the political discourse started to change. And there are two parts to this change. One in which we see increases in nationalism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, right? And we see that displayed very well in what happened in the United States, for example, but not only. This was a global phenomenon, right? But then on the other hand, in the same time, there is a concerted effort on the part of the global community to address these issues. And this is how we got to have the 2016 New York Declaration and 2 global compacts being developed that were meant to actually provide strategies to address migration issues. Now, there are tensions around this concept of having 2 global compacts. Why not only one? And the tensions appear because you do have a lot of overlaps. When you're talking about safe, regular migration in the global compact on migration, and then you talk about refugees, and you talk about irregular migrants, as I said, categories are fluid. They fluctuate. They are not always so clear. But anyway, these compacts were created, and in 2018, in December 2018, they were formally adopted. Now, I don't know how much our audience knows about the way in which UN documents work, but in many ways, the global compacts work like a declaration, right? So you do have a framework, but it doesn't have necessarily the legal enforcement power.
Right. So it's not legally binding.
It's not legally. Well, it is and it's not. It's not legally binding in the traditional terms. We do have countries that say, yes, we want to, and the majority of the UN member countries actually said, yes, we want to adopt that. They were adopted. What does that mean? It means that now we will work on implementing parts or all of each of the frameworks. However, it is not like, for example, when you have a convention. When you have a convention, through ratification, countries assume responsibility to actually review their own legislation and make sure that their own legislation will align with the text of the convention. And there are bodies and there are mechanisms through which you can really look, hold them accountable. With the global compacts, we have the civil society actually taking a very active role and trying to ensure that accountability mechanisms are being created through constant monitoring. But it's not exactly like a law. We're not there yet.
Right. Civil society was involved, but it's really an agreement of governments. So I'm wondering if the purpose is to protect human rights of migrants and increase safety, reduce forced migration, there's also this concept of managing migration, which seems to be a bit more like national security thinking. So since this is drawn up by governments, what do you think are its strengths and its weaknesses?
Of the global compacts or of the concept of managing migration?
Well, I think
I can talk to both.
Yeah, actually both. It's good.
So, when you're talking to different migrant scholars, they will tell you that migration should not be managed, right? Because it's like, what do you mean managing migration? And it can be dangerous. And I would be cautious with this, although I'll tell you the other side of the coin as well. But I will be a bit cautious with this. Why? Because what we are seeing emerging over the past 10 years is a very strong securitization framework in migration policies. What is a securitization framework? Well, basically, we protect our own, and whatever policies are put in place, globally, regionally, or nationally, are meant to secure a specific part of the population from the rest. And here is where nationalism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia actually worked, unfortunately, to further increase the divide between people. So instead of providing, of really looking at tools and legislation that we need to create safe spaces through a securitization framework, we're not pushing for safety. We're pushing for security. On the other hand, when I am thinking of managing migration, I'm thinking, how can we manage migration in a way that is conducive to increasing safety? But that would mean a reverse situation in which we listen to the people themselves. What does safety mean for them? Like, let me give you a simple example. So you have the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, right? One of the most respectable bodies that is working around the clock to address forced migration, at least for specific, well-defined population categories, population groups. And one of the tools that is being used through the work of UNHCR within a humanitarian context, right, is refugee camps. Now, what is the purpose of refugee camps? What is the primary purpose? The primary purpose is to provide safety. However, in most situations, refugee camps are everything but safe. And of course, you have different population groups in the refugee camps that are more exposed. And with over 40% of all migrants being children, and between 46 and 49% of all forcibly displaced people being women, you know, these are the most exposed, the most vulnerable. And on one hand, we create these entities, these enclosed entities that are then being transformed based on a securitization approach. In Greece, you know, like we're looking at the Greek islands, how many of the camps were actually militarized, closed camps, closely monitoring who's going in, who's going out, giving people a sense of imprisonment, right? So I think on one hand, managing migration is hard because of all these aspects. On the other, it could be done differently. And this is what the two global compacts try to do, saying, okay, we want to actually have better instruments, better laws, better collaboration between countries, so we can actually make migration safer, right? But just by writing this down, we did not resolve the issue. We have to work on changing paradigms, on changing contexts, on constantly reminding each other and ourselves that we need to listen to the other parts, to engage with the migrants themselves, to monitor the situation on the ground. You mentioned, interestingly enough, in my slide, if you notice, like we go all the way to October 2020, right? When you mentioned, the tragedy of almost at least 140 people that drowned. Well, we have the Global Compact that should be operational. And one of the most important objectives of the Global Compact, at least for my subcommittee, we're focusing on two, and one in particular, like these two in particular, looking at the others as well, is to really provide more safety and decrease vulnerabilities for migrants in vulnerable situations. But also that's objective number 7. Objective number 5, which is the other one, is to enhance regular paths for migration. Well, if you look at this accident, clearly those two objectives were not achieved by the countries that were supposed to work on them, right? By the global community. So on one hand, we do have a great framework. Thank you for bringing it up. On the other hand, we need to work and think, okay, now that we have a great framework, what would be some best practices, some good practices that could be replicated, that we need to know about and disseminate, so okay, we can continue to increase safety. Going back to like this, okay, so we do have the Global Compact. We also have laws, international laws, that are supposed to protect forced migrants, right? So we have at the core of all these international laws, the Convention on the Status of Refugees, that will be 70 next year, right? And I think on one hand, this is a celebratory moment. On the other hand, it's a moment of reflection. 70 years. A lot of things changed. Migration contexts changed. Social issues, those adverse drivers, the push factors that are forcing people out of their communities changed, amplified, became more complex. Therefore, the categories that are currently used based on this convention need to be revisited. When you're talking about the status of a refugee, that comes with some rights and some protections that are important. Right.
Is the concept of forced migrant a way to get around those rights of refugees in some ways? I mean, is that why governments choose to call one group migrants instead of refugees?
Yes. There is that distinction that, like you can see it used most of the times not to increase rights, but to limit rights, right? So the convention actually comes with a very specific category, but even that category is very nuanced, right? So people with well-founded fear of persecution, well, how well-founded needs to be, like who decides is well-founded? What do we need to have in place? That are members of a social group. Here, we have continuous tensions around gender and how gender-based violence should or should not be considered as a reason for, as part of the criteria included in the definition. Ultimately, I think when you are looking at forced migrants, wherever they are, people that did not choose to leave, they were forced to leave by different reasons, by different factors, they are all refugees. They are all refugees. They are leaving their countries and are seeking refuge in other countries. The difference that the current laws make is one group is recognized or could be, has, the hope to be recognized, to get a recognized status of refugee, while the other groups are unrecognized refugees. There is power in language and there is power in laws. The two global compacts should actually more intentional address these issues.
I noticed that the committee also addresses the issue of statelessness and of internally displaced people, and those are yet other categories.
Absolutely. And we do have most of the forced displaced people are actually internally displaced. We do have currently 45.7 million internally displaced people out of the 79.5 total forcibly displaced people. So you can see that this indeed, it's a major issue and needs to be addressed and needs to be resolved. Statelessness, I worked on actually on a project, part of my work focused on Haiti and the forced displacement, forced migration in Haiti. And based on the change in the laws in the Dominican Republic, revisiting birthrights, and then another provision that was added, making this law, the law in itself is not unique. This exists in many countries, but there was an added provision that said this law will actually be applied retroactively to 1929, which rendered approximately an estimated number of 200,000 people stateless. And here they are. And this is one of the very complex situations, right? You have people that are now forced either through mechanisms that are not that visible, but people talking to us during my time there and looking at this episode of forced migration were telling us we were afraid, we had to leave, or directly taken and deported by government bodies, right, into Haiti. They are Haitians, yet they never lived there. They are Dominicans. They think of themselves as Dominicans, yet they do not have papers, or if they did have papers, their papers are no longer recognized. What are they? In our discussions around this, like even with some of the representatives of UNHCR, do they fit the category of refugees? Of course, if they would claim that, UNHCR will be there to protect them and represent them, but do they fit that? So this shows the complexity of the issue. And it is so much harder to actually claim protection for the stateless population. Who will protect them, right? We do not have very well specified laws, but even more harder to protect the internally displaced. Why? Because they are still within their own countries, because we respect national sovereignty. We don't want that to be taken away. But on the other hand, there are no protections for them. So if you're thinking of the Rohingya, for example, right, displaced within their own country and then becoming stateless and running, escaping into Bangladesh, who is protecting them? Right. I mean, Hannah Arendt's words that are, like with us since 1949, I hope I don't give you the wrong date, that said like, a refugee actually loses their fundamental right to have rights. And that's what we have to claim first. Because within a human rights paradigm, the state, the government, is the main duty bearer, responsible to provide protection. So if you leave a country, you cannot prevail yourself of the protections of that government. You're going into other countries that do not recognize you as one that deserves protection within their own borders. And we shifted this whole notion of human rights to an artificial notion that we created of citizens' rights. When you're talking about forced migrants, we have to go back to really claiming human rights that are universal and should apply to them.
Based on human dignity, based on universal criteria. You mentioned UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, but there's also IOM. And I was wondering if you could speak to the difference.
Well, Yes, so UNHCR has a very, very distinct status, right? This is a UN agency that is really closely monitoring and regulating, in as much as UN bodies regulate anything, regulating forced migration, particularly concerning either refugees or asylum seekers. And the distinction there, again, it's a very fluid distinction. I can come back to that if you want to tell you how things are more complicated in the US than in other parts of the world. So refugees and asylum seekers or stateless, right? So these populations fall, and to some extent they are looking at or monitoring the situation of the internally displaced. Now, when we are talking, you mentioned and UNHCR is a global UN agency, right? IOM, International Office of Migration, their initial focus was mostly on migrants being labor migrants, being undocumented migrants that would not fit neatly into other categories. However, more recently, the two organizations started partnering more closely. You see IOM depending more on government funding and being more, in a way, government controlled than UNHCR. So there are tensions there. For the two global compacts, the UNHCR, in a way, is it takes charge fully for the global compact on refugees, while the IOM is the main, organization taking charge of the global compact on migration, safe, regular, and orderly migration. However, the IOM is also one of the international organizations that is best in actually collecting data and monitoring and identifying new ways in which we can really gather more consistent data on migration. We don't have that. I mean, migration data is one of the hardest to work with because there are so many inconsistencies, starting from definitions all the way to what variables are important and how do we record that. I was actually, in preparation for our talk today, I was looking at some statistics on death rates, and this is one of the hardest things to measure. Because how do you measure how many migrants died? Do we have that data? Is that recorded? We have estimates, right? But you compare, the fatalities to the percentage of the population at risk. So this is what you look at. How many people are at least, or what is the percentage of population at risk? How many of them die? What is the percentage of people that die from this one? How do we define population at risk? Varies. So that will, from the start, not give us a good grounding of the data that we collect.
Well, certainly migrants need all the allies and advocates and champions that they can get. And yet, as you spoke about, it's important that their voice also be heard.
Yes.
Do you find that happens? I saw some notations about, I think it was a big conference. Let's see, it was called the Global Forum on Migration and Development.
Yes.
And there was some conversation about trying to bring in migrants' own voices more extensively. And it's difficult. They're ghettoized.
Yes. Well, thank you for bringing this up. This talks about, the events to, keep watching on because they are coming. The Global Forum actually is scheduled for January 11 to 15 in Dubai this coming year. So we're very close. And actually civil society in general and our committee in particular, along with other UN NGO committees, are actually, looking at ways in which we can inform, we can actually write statements and contribute to the preparations for the Global Forum. The Global Forum actually has 6 major priorities for this year that will be addressed in January. And 2 of them are aligning very well with the Global Compact on Migration. One is addressing gaps in immigrant protection, which, we talked about all these fluid definitions, categories, lack of legislation or contradictory laws between regional, global, and national laws. And the second one is objective, or thematic priority number 5, that actually will discuss approaches to increase safety in migration, right? Approaches to increase safety and address irregular migration. So this whole concept of irregularity, fluidity of status. Voices of migrants clearly became important, and I think that the involvement of civil society in addressing forced migration was essential in actually pointing towards the voices of the migrants. The subcommittee I work with actually is conducting a study looking at migrant stories as collected by different organizations already. So we tried to identify stories that directly report what the migrant said, like what the person living with an experience of migration said. And we are looking at what the stories say and how does that align with the Global Compact on Migration. And what do we learn from their stories in regards to strength, best practices, protections that were put in place during the last year or so, or challenges, gaps, limitations, ways in which they do not feel safe and the Global Compact actually fails in achieving its objectives.
Meanwhile, we see that the governments are imposing that securitized regime on the whole problem. I was reading this past week about a man who was arrested in Greece because he and his young son were shipwrecked on the way to Greece, and his son drowned. And now he's being charged with the crime of endangering his son on top of losing his son. So that's, he's not being charged with smuggling. It's, not, he didn't organize the boat coming over, but he's being charged with being a bad parent, which just, adds. So again, let's blame the victim instead of creating a better system for migration. We have to break for a moment, and we'll be right back. I wanted to encourage viewers, if they wish to put a question in for Professor Popescu, you can put it in the comments section if you're watching this live. And we'll be right back after this. And we're back. This is Adam Carroll, working with Justice for All, and the show is UN This Week. And we're speaking about the global migrant crisis, or crisis of migration, with Professor Marciana Popescu. And thanks for coming back. Thanks for being on the show, by the way. I think just to go ahead and I see there may be some comments in the, but not questions yet. So as far as other activities at the UN, what are current trends and current activities that maybe we haven't discussed?
Well, there are a number of UN NGO committees that are organizing webinars, trying to have roundtables, engaging with youth. Our own committee actually invited youth speakers for our general meeting, monthly general meeting today, and we learned about different initiatives around the world that actually aim to increase agency and activism of youth leaders and also recognize their agency and activism. Of course, everything is done remotely. We are seeing, however, a flourishing of initiatives and webinars and sessions that aim to, address the issues that we mentioned and raise awareness on, xenophobia, on, other more like looking at migration, for example, through the lens of gender. The UN Women, as well as the Women Refugee Council, as another organization, are looking at that and trying to raise issues. What do we do in regards to the rights of women migrants? Because there we are dealing with reproductive rights, and we had in the press recently in the United States, the whole issue of forced sterilization claims in immigrant detention centers. So there is a flurry of awareness. I think in a way this is a silver lining, because at least we know. And it is out in the open. All these issues are being raised, not that they are new. They were happening all along. Some of us knew about them, but there was very little attention. So at least we can use that. Now, of course, now we are at the intersection of a very important historic time. And we do hope that with a change in administration, other aspects will change. civil
I did want to
society.
ask about, I was noticing just in the news that the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees was facing delaying the salaries of thousands of its employees because the U.S. hasn't paid it's withdrawn its
Yes,
support.
yes.
And
Well, yeah.
and it's serving millions of Palestinians. And so
Yes.
again, what policy changes do you see coming with the new administration?
Well, actually, I think I do have another slide that I prepared
Uh,
for you just to kind of like not forget anything. But it is very interesting because there is a lot of talk already about policy changes that the Biden administration will introduce. Let me just quickly share this with you. Okay. In one of the most recent publications reports of the the Women Refugee Council, basically they shared what the President-elect Biden's team shared with them regarding what can be expected, as we move on. But before we even go into that, I think the overall change will come with a change in attitudes, and I think we could have seen we already saw a little bit of that, like recognizing the humanity in others, trying to talk across groups and really engage with multiple groups, listening, having empathy and humility. All that was missing from the political discourse for the past 4 years, and I think that's where we need to start, But what they concretely committed to do is, one, raise the annual U.S. refugee admission target. We know that over the past 3 years, over the past 4 years, but more emphasized over the past 3 years, this administration managed to almost close completely the refugee resettlement program. Which is an extremely traumatic issue because it not only, it puts the life of so many refugees that were vetted through very strict processes at risk now. They are back at the end of the line. What will happen to them? But also here, you have so many organizations that were committed to working with refugees. Some of them had been forced to close their doors. Right. So you are losing resources, trained people that could provide the immediate support needed for any effective integration of a population that is resettled in the United States. The second one, which again, talks to that reclaiming of humanity, in my opinion, they committed to rescind any inhumane travel bans, including the so-called Muslim ban. That's one of the darkest pages, I think, in the history of the United States. I came to the United States 20 years ago. I chose this country because I saw it as a country that stands for global rights, global human rights. Of course, we can go back to history and actually see other situations in the United States. This is not new, but it was escalated to a point in which it became, presidential policy. And that's a problem. So I'm very glad to see that as one of the immediate commitments. They want to reverse the Trump administration policy of separating families that are seeking safety at the U.S. border. And you mentioned, not paying salaries. I would add to that, not only that the United States withdrew from multiple international treaties and, really started withdrawing from all its responsibilities on the global stage, but we also are dealing with a pandemic that was actually misused, abused to further restrict immigration laws, and for none other than preventing people from coming to the United States. Is this unique? No, it's not. We know that other countries close their borders, and by closing borders, that actually increased vulnerability of people on the move. The United States, however, went an extra step and, unearthed a provision that was never meant to have people stopped from coming, to stop the asylum processes. But this is exactly what the public health provision of March 20th, 2020 did. And that affected the safety of the families that are waiting at the border, along with other policies that were created to do exactly that. They will also end the Trump administration devastating anti-asylum policies, the other policies that I've referred to before, really, we have the migrant protection protocols, known as Remain in Mexico. These protocols did not provide any type of protection. Actually, I had the opportunity last spring to, go to the border with like in Arizona. Like we went to Nogales. Nogales is a city that extends on both sides of the border, and talked to migrants there, and they were sharing their stories. With many of them, traveling for weeks or months to reach the U.S. border, and then having to wait there, not knowing if they will ever be allowed to present their case. Well, the Global Compact on Migration talks about enhancing regular paths. I had a conversation with a friend of mine that said people should try to follow the regular legal path. Well, many of these regular legal paths are being removed. Mm-hmm. And they do not see such a path. And of course, you see, like they also committed to other changes, one of them being to restore the funding for the United Nations Populations Fund and for the World Health Organization. This was another like darkest moment in our history when we withdrew funding from the WHO in the midst of a pandemic, and to rejoin the Global Climate Change Agreement. Climate migration is a serious issue. It's not well framed, and it's not enough. It's not addressed enough, and that is one of the priorities for our committee and for many of the UN bodies seeing the effects of climate change when it comes to forced migration.
Well, I think that all of that is very challenging, but it's good to see the commitments from the Biden people. And we hope they'll get a chance to implement that, and that we'll have a chance at a future show to give a report card and see how they've done. But, there will be pushback. Of course, Trump and his people are not going away entirely. They'll be tweeting at least, and perhaps they'll have their own TV stations promoting xenophobia. So there's the remaining clear and present danger, really. But if we can show and build and develop and support real solidarity, then we can stand against that. So I hope that your committee will continue on. It's really very active. I was just noticing that you have recent meetings discussing the refugee campfire, the Chilean policy, migrant children, the U.S. asylum procedures, remittances, climate-induced displacement, just really concrete subjects. So it looks like a really admirable committee. Yeah, I'm really glad about that, and that the presence and impact of the NGOs at the UN can continue to grow. It's not always easy.
And if I can just add, I think one fascinating aspect about the NGO Committee on Migration, in my opinion, is the amazing way in which it managed to bring together lifers, in a way, people that were their entire life to promote human rights through various UN bodies here and globally, a very diverse international group, but also bringing in students, young people that are now learning and engaging. And I think this is how we build capacity for, addressing all the challenges that we still need to address. They will be the ones to take over and move us onto a different page, hopefully with migration redefined as a human right and migrants' rights being truly protected.
God willing. And if people want to go to your website, will they be able to contact someone if they have a question?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe what they can do. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Marciana Popescu. And this is UN This Week. We'll see you next Tuesday. And thank you very much for listening and watching. Take care.